Hi everyone, my name is Hazel Lee, and today I'll be sharing the story of the dioxin disaster in Times Beach, Missouri. This isn't just about a chemical spill, it's about how something invisible changed the fate of an entire town. What happened in Times Beach was a public health crisis, a failure of government response, and ultimately a turning point in US environmental policy. Let's take a closer look at how it all unfolded. Before we dive in, here's what I hope to cover. First, what exactly happened in Times Beach, and how did things go so wrong? Second, how did dioxin contamination affect the health and lives of the people living there? Then we'll break down the government's response from evacuation to cleanup. We'll also explore how this case led to major policy reforms. And finally, we'll reflect on why this story still matters today, especially through the lens of environmental justice. Here's a quick outline of today's story. We'll begin with the town before the disaster, then follow how the crisis unfolded and spread. We'll look at the health and environmental consequences and how the entire community was evacuated. Then I'll walk you through the cleanup and the changes triggered in US policy. And finally, we'll look back at what we've learned and what still needs attention. Times Beach was a small working class town in Missouri, near the Merrimack River and a major highway. It seemed quiet and unremarkable until 1972. That year, the town began spraying waste oil on unpaved roads to control dust. But the oil came from a chemical plant and was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known. The map shows the red arrows tracing where the oil was sprayed. These roads cut through neighborhoods, ran near the river and highway, helping the contamination spread across the whole town. Here's a graph showing dioxin levels in the soil from 1972 to 1983. For most of the 70s, the levels were pretty low, but starting around 1980, things changed so fast. The numbers shot up, especially by 1982. That spike is what got the EPA's attention and led a full investigation and eventually evacuation. Basically, this data showed just how serious the contamination had become. This bar graph shows how many people were relocated each year. In 1983, around 500 people left. But in 1984, after a major flood and growing media coverage, full-scale federal relocation began, with over 1,100 people moved out that year. By 1985, just a few hundred remained. In only 3 years, Times Beach was completely emptied, not by a natural disaster, but by the slow realization of an invisible one. This pie chart shows how the cleanup budget was used. About 10% went to a long-term environmental monitoring to track dioxin levels over time. Transportation of the contaminated soil took up a significant portion, as did hazard pay for workers handling toxic materials. Incinerating the soil accounted for a large share of the cost, and the biggest portion, 40%, was spent on actually removing the contaminated soil from the site. In total, the cleanup cost over 200 million, making it one of the most expensive Superfund cleanups in US history. This timeline shows how the disaster played out over 2 decades. It began in 1971 with contaminated oil sprayed on roads. The spraying stopped in 1976, but the damage had already been done. By 1982, government agencies confirmed toxic levels of dioxin. In 1983, the town was evacuated. In 1985, Times Beach was officially disincorporated, and finally, in 1997, the area was declared safe and reopened as Route 66 State Park. This long timeline shows how environmental damage can take years to fully reveal and even longer to clean up. To sum up, more than 2,000 residents were permanently relocated. While few illnesses were officially confirmed, the fear of the long term health effect lingered. The cleanup cost over 200 million, and the disaster helped strengthen the Superfund law and reshape how the US handles toxic waste. Times Beach is remembered as a landmark case in environmental health and a warning of how invisible contamination can destroy entire communities. These are the main resources I used, including the EPA, CDC, Missouri Department of Natural Resources, and media archives. If you're interested in learning more, these references are a great place to start. And that brings us to the end of the story of Times Beach. This wasn't just an environmental accident, it was a wake up call about how slow action and invisible danger can change lives. It reminds us that environmental health isn't only about chemicals, it's about people, policy, and justice. Thank you so much for listening and stay safe. Goodbye.